The first heat of June came early, puckering the marsh and curling the leaves of the canes so they whispered together like people telling on themselves. On Calabash Plantation the air had weight and taste, the lick of brine from the Gulf, the mineral breath of the river where it turned slow and brown around the point, the faint copper of rusting hinges on 100 doors that never closed quiet. Zephine had learned to hear things in that kind of air. You could listen to it and know when a storm turned in its sleep over the Gulf, or when a rider approached down the Shell Road by the way the white dust chose to lift. She kept to the edge of sight most days, where kitchen steam met the yard's glare, a seamstress's needle glinting in her palm like a sliver of river sun. She moved without hurry, small-framed and straight-backed, because even the quickest work lost truth when rushed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. In the kitchen shed, where the brick hearth kept its own season, Zephine worked cloth and thread into small, still bodies that looked like toys if you didn't know better. Old cloth from retired dresses. Husk from last year's corn. Spanish moss teased and aired to keep the chiggers off. She stitched eyes without pupils so worry could not find them. And because she knew letters, secret and furtive as a fox in a henhouse, she tucked tiny words inside the seams, folded like seed. She had learned to read by the riverbank in evenings that looked too quiet to be honest. A boatman preacher, free and careful, had traced his finger through sand and whispered sounds until the marks became doors she could walk through alone. No one knew about the letters. No one must. There were laws that snapped like traps for such things, laws that could take a person's tongue and hands and still call it mercy. So Zephine kept her reading in the undersides of things, names pressed between recipe pages in the plantation mistress's books when she was called to mend a torn binding, measurements chalked small on the inside of door frames, letters stitched backward into the hems of curtains that would face the river. She called it hiding in daylight. It was also a kind of prayer. The mistress, Mrs. Eugenie Renault, was a tall white woman with a long neck and a face that pretended gentleness until something pried it open. She liked pale dresses and white gloves, even in heat that drove the dogs to shade. Her husband, Adrian, had made himself important trading cotton and sugar and rumors. But it was Eugenie who ruled the house with whispers. A lady could do more with a murmur than a man with a whip. She had a laugh like glass. On a Monday when the cane's leaves shivered without wind, Eugenie sent for Zephine. The house smelled of lemon and starch, a clean cut the way a blade cut. Your hands, Eugenie said, looking not at Zephine but at the seam she had just turned on a sleeve. They make fine work. My mother's baptism gown is in ruin from years and damp. You will bring it back. Zephine nodded. Yes, ma'am. Her voice was soft enough to be missed. Eugenie's eyes were pale blue like old china. And you will unlearn certain habits. I see your lips move when you count stitches. I don't like counting in this house. She smiled as if she had said something clever. Yes, ma'am. The words lay cool on Zephine's tongue. But behind them, thought moved like an eel in dark water. He brought her news. There were meetings north of here, off the road where sugar dust turned your skin sticky, men and women learning to listen for signs, to pass messages that looked like market lists. A quilter downriver stitched stars with odd points, and a barefoot boy rode errands on a mule that looked like sorrow. Etienne had a way of making dangerous things sound like ordinary work, the kind a person could pick up and set down in daylight. Zephine liked that. She didn't want a story that required trumpets. She wanted a story that could slide into the house with her under the door. Can you read? She asked him, casual as you ask about rain. Enough to get lost, he said. You? Enough to lay a trail. She took a bit of charcoal from her pocket and scribbled 3 letters on a clean shell, E, R, and a small, sturdy A. Eugenie Renault, she said and dropped the shell in the river where it spun once and sank. Names don't like water. You're angry, Etienne observed. Not the interesting kind, Zephine said. Anger like hot oil, it does a clean job quick, but it ruins the pan. I need the pan. He nodded as if she had told him a recipe, and maybe she had. What do you need? He asked finally. She told him what she had not told anyone out loud. How Eugenie had sent the girl from the dairy to the quarters without shoes for speaking the word library too clear when a visitor asked for the privy. How a child was sold to pay for a new pianoforte because Eugenie had said the old one sounded like dead bees. How the mistress wore white gloves as if purity were something you could buy and wash and put back on. How she laughed once at a funeral and afterwards said she had thought of something funny. "I think," Zéphine said very slowly, "that I can make her feel the truth she won't look at." "That truth don't like to be held," Etienne warned. "I'll sew it shut," she answered, and the part of her that feared everything, even mourning, fell quiet for a moment. Zéphine's craft had started as survival. You learn patience from thread. You learn that tension is good only up to a point, and after that it cuts. You learn to read a body by how it comes apart. And you learn to make small likenesses that listen. The doll began as cloth the color of river mud. She cut a pattern by eye, 2 doubled pieces shaped like a person who had forgotten pride. Spanish moss for body, a twist of hair from Zéphine's own comb for a lock that said "I'm here with you," and a bit of soot from the kitchen hearth for memory. She stitched the seams with backstitch fine as gnats, a seam that would not pull when someone tugged. In the chest she had a folded scrap torn from the inside lining of a book Eugenie cherished, the one with pressed camellias like flat moons. On the scrap she had written, in letters so tiny they trembled, "We are not your dream." She made the face last. No pupils. No mouth. A face you brought yourself to, not one that told you what to feel. She pricked the doll with a pin in one shoulder and felt foolish and strong in the same breath. "You don't do the hurt," Adelie had told her once as they scraped bowls together. "You invite the hurt to show itself. That's all a good curse is." Zéphine didn't like the word curse. It was a word white people used to keep old power underfoot where it couldn't speak properly. She preferred calling. She called to what already was, then asked it to sit at the table. The first sign came small. Eugenie's perfectly white gloves, laid seam to seam in the camphor drawer, yellowed at the fingertips overnight. She held them up with her mouth pinched. "The laundress is to be whipped," she announced, though she had no proof and needed none. But when the overseer reached to carry out the order, his wrist seized sudden as a horse's surprise. He let out an oath and a laugh, shook his hand, and the moment passed. Still, the laugh sounded thin. "I will have new gloves sent from New Orleans," Eugenie said, examining her hands as if they were something expensive she had just acquired. Zéphine returned to the kitchen and replaced the single pin in the doll with 2, set crosswise in the wrist. The second sign was a smell. Eugenie's room, always lemon and starch and the ghost of lavender from sachets, began to catch at the throat. Not rot, not exactly. Something like a cupboard too long closed on damp. "There's mildew in the north wall," Eugenie told Adrian, and men came with hammers and chalk to mark the plaster. But no stain showed. The smell strengthened when Eugenie lay down to nap, and eased when she stood near the window. It seemed to prefer the bed and the curve of her shoulder. "Open all the shutters," she commanded. And they did. Air moved like a thought through the house, lifting curtains, creeping under doors. The smell persisted like an argument that refused to be resolved. At night Zéphine sat with the doll under her cot and told it what to remember. She spoke into its cloth the shape of how Eugenie spoke to the dairy girl, the way she said library with her lips turned down as if the word had offended her. She told the doll about the child and the pianoforte, about laughter at a grave. She wasn't sure if the doll needed stories. She needed to say them. Days stacked. The river fell half an inch, then rose a whole hand. Came through bright knives at the sun. News came and went like stray animals. This man bought, that woman sold, a cousin gone because someone's debt was heavy. Zéphine worked. She took in mending from the quarters and from the big house, a quiet economy of thread that turned hunger away from a few doors without asking permission. She made small tokens, cornhusk angels that could stand on a shelf and look like hope without frightening anyone, and traded them for salt, for soap, for a little time. She listened to the air. Each month had a sound. In July, frogs spelled a word no one had taught them. In August the cicadas screamed until the world felt like a kettle left on the fire. In September the crickets changed to a slower counting. Through it all, Eugenie's face thinned the way a candle thins when it burns straight and no one trims the wick. She grew jumpy. She pressed her hand to the back of her neck absent-mindedly as if something insisted on being noticed there. She hired a Catholic priest to bless the house, and a Protestant minister to undo the blessing just in case, and then a woman from town who sold little blue bottles of awful medicine and big claims. The smell drifted after them like a cat unwilling to be scooted. Adrian endured it in his way, by going away more often. Business, he said, a word that meant 2 days to New Orleans for cards and relief. He returned sharper each time, as if the city had polished him and taken something of him in exchange. He watched Eugenie with the wary affection of a man who loves the idea of calm and suspects it of betrayal. "Do we have enemies?" Eugenie asked him one night when the shutters quivered though the air beyond was still. "Of course we have enemies," he said, smiling. "Success breeds envy." "I do not mean men with ledgers," she said. "I mean eyes. Women's eyes." Adrian poured brandy as if that were the answer. "Eyes can't hurt you," he said. "Unless you believe in childish things." "Childish things have teeth," she replied, but she drank anyway. Zéphine went on with her work because work was what a life could be built from when stone and paper denied you. She learned the exact weight of a pin between finger and thumb so she could place it without looking. She learned how to stitch a hair into a seam so it would not show and yet would never, ever leave. She learned how to carry silence like a jug without spilling. The doll took to living in a basket she kept near her cot, nestled in scraps that had all known some white woman's collarbone. On the doll's chest, Zéphine added a second scrap of writing. This one was from her own hand, copied from the book pages she fixed for Eugenie, a verse about justice rolling down like waters, though she did not say whose justice or whose waters. Words carried themselves, they chose their work. "I don't want to hurt her," Zéphine said aloud one night because saying the truth you wanted could steady your feet. The dark breathed back. "I want to make her look." When the looking began in earnest, it did not feel like victory. It felt like the first cough after a long silence, ugly and honest. Eugenie started at nothing. The kitchen bell clanged itself once in the afternoon with no hand on the rope. A mirror turned milky for a moment when she leaned close to wipe a smudge of cold cream from her cheek. Her right shoulder tightened when she reached for her hairpins and let go again when she placed them on the dresser, tighten, let go, tighten, let go, like an unseen drum teaching her its beat. "Who sews my sleeves too narrow?" she demanded at supper, though the dress had been cut by a French seamstress in town. "I cannot abide shoddy work." Zéphine kept her face quiet. At night Eugenie dreamed of moss. It crept along the baseboards, scaled the bedposts, threaded itself through the whiteness of her gloves, knotted them to the rail. She woke with the taste of wet bark in her mouth. The first morning she found it, real, not dreamed, was a Sunday. A little twist of gray-green on the floor by her bed, no bigger than a mouse, smelling clean and old at once. She called for a broom and did not say her hand trembled when she swept. The house whispered the way Cain whispers, a thin voice everywhere at once. The laundress told the carpenter that the mistress was walking softer lately. The stable boy told the dairy girl that Eugenie looked over her shoulder when she poured milk. The dairy girl told Zéphine nothing. She held her eyes on the butter until her reflection steadied there and only then looked up to say, "Thank you for what you ain't done." Zéphine's hands ached from caution. You could press too hard and turn the thread, force the needle, and all you would have then was a knot where a seam ought to be. She slowed. She pricked the doll at the back of the neck with 3 pins set like a little crown, then removed one because cruelty hid itself in 3s. She washed the cloth body in river water and laid it to dry on a stone where sun reached without trying. Etienne returned on a weeknight with his careful posture and a bag that smelled of river mud and iron. "A skiff," he said. "Found one tucked where the willow roots pretend to be ashore. Old but sturdy. It could carry 2 in a basket." "A basket?" Zéphine asked, though her heart had already reached for it. He looked at her with a question and then a knowing. "You aim to take something with you," he said. "Not a thing you can eat or wear." I aim to take names, she said. On paper. Folded so small they can't find them unless they know what paper is for. He nodded slow. There's a woman upriver who binds books from rags. She'll give you a traveler's book with a hollow back if you ask right. You can pass your names along if you don't ever speak them. Zephine imagined it, pages closing over names the way lids close over eyes in blessing. She had no illusions about the scale of what one woman and one doll could accomplish. But scales mattered less than intention when you had so few tools. A stitch could hold a sail to a mast or a shroud to a body. The stitch didn't know the difference, the hands did. Summer bent toward the fearsome light of harvest. Men and women went into cane with cutlasses and came out with thin cuts across their knuckles and a sweetness in their noses that made their heads ache. The overseer counted and shouted and sang a cruel march to keep time. You'll let it rest, Adelie warned Zephine one evening when she saw her eyes go to the basket before her feet had found her cot. Else you pull the whole thing tight and it snaps. I will wait, Zephine said. She turned the doll face down and put a piece of bread on its back the way you weigh down a paper to keep it from blowing off the table. She slept a sleep of bits and edges. Waiting did not mean nothing happened. Sometimes the most powerful stitch was the one you did not make yet. The house, deprived of closings, letters sent, punishments delivered, orders barked and obeyed, began to itch under its paint. The carpenter found a new crack above the east window where no weather touched. The bell clanged twice in the night. The smell moved from Eugenie's room into the long upstairs hall and paused in front of a nursery that had never held a baby. Eugenie's face grew earnest, as if she had been caught by a thought that would not put her down. She stopped wearing pale blue, as if the color had betrayed her. She took to visiting Adelie in the kitchen, a thing she had never done, and stood watching bread rise as if it might give up its secrets under her gaze. The first time she did it, Adelie kept on kneading as if white ladies came to her room every day to learn how life became itself in a pan. What makes it live? Eugenie asked, a moving at the edge of sanity brightness at her eyes. Yeast, said Adelie placidly. And patience. I have had too much patience, Eugenie said. That's not what you've had, Adelie replied, and folded the dough as if it were a body she liked. Sometimes truth could sit on a table and not be recognized by anyone in the room. On a Wednesday when the sky looked like pewter and the river like a mirror laid face down, Eugenie asked for the baptism gown. I will see what you have done with what was ruined, she said to Zephine. Her tone tried for command and landed nearer supplication. Zephine brought it, wrapped in muslin like a fragile idea. She had cleaned it without drowning it, pieced it where gaps yawned without lying about the gaps. The restored lace caught light the way an old woman's hair does when she sits in a window. Eugenie touched the hem with her gloved fingertips and then, forgetting herself, unloved one hand to feel it proper. Her fingers came up with a strand of Spanish moss clinging to them, though Zephine had never brought the doll and the gown together. Eugenie stared at the moss as if it were writing she could almost but not quite sound out. She wrapped the strand around her finger without meaning to and then, again without meaning to, tightened it until the tip of her finger went pale. Madam, Zephine said quietly. Eugenie blinked, unspooled the moss, let it fall. You have done skillful work, she said. The words cost her something. I will send a note to my mother. That afternoon the piano in the parlor exhaled a single, wheezing note while no one sat at it. The dairy girl crossed herself and then pretended she had only scratched her shoulder. Adrian made a sound that wanted to be a joke and couldn't find its shape. Night came curtain and thick. Zephine went to the river because the air in the quarters had learned to carry other people's breath and she needed the old breath of a big thing. She thought about the plans she and Etienne had rolled like dough between them, names written, doll quieted, a night picked when the moon would be small and the water high. She thought of leaving without triumph, without a single thing anyone could point to and say here is the moment when the world cracked and new light shone through. She thought of leaving as you untie a knot in good rope, patient, sure, unwilling to cut and lose length you might need later. She did not hear Eugenie until the woman was nearly beside her on the path that led from house to river. The mistress carried a lamp that made a bubble of light in which all leaves and weeds looked like actors auditioning as themselves. She wore a wrapper hastily tied, hair loose as if she had fled herself and overtaken her own body in the yard. "What do you do here?" Eugenie asked. Not accusatory. Curious. A child at a door she has been told leads to a room with music. "I breathe," Zéphine said, the truth sounding like defiance only because other truths had been stamped out in this place. Eugenie came close enough that Zéphine could see the black thread caught at the hem of the wrapper, a thread Zéphine recognized as her own because she had a way of twinning two strands that left a particular shadow, like a faint braid. "Someone is thinking of me when I do not watch," Eugenie said. It sounded like a confession. "Yes, ma'am," Zéphine said, which could mean anything. "It is you." Eugenie's voice did not rise. "I can feel it when you look." "Not your eyes, your—" "I don't have a word." "Hands," Zéphine offered, because hands could be blamed for anything. "Hands," Eugenie repeated. She lifted hers as if they were foreign birds that had landed, for now, on her wrists. "What do your hands want?" Zéphine thought of the doll under her cot, face turned to muslin so it would not fill with other people's need. She thought of the name she meant to carry in a book with a hollow back. She thought of the white gloves gone yellow and the smell that would not move when you told it to. She thought, carefully, of the dairy girl's barefoot walk and of laughter at a grave. "To make right measure," she said. "In cloth you can see it, too tight and it puckers, too loose and it sags. There is a right lay to thread and a right ease to a sleeve. I want that." "For me?" Eugenie asked, with a waver that tried to hide itself. "For the room," said Zéphine, and the room was the world. They stood with the river making old talk below. A moth battered itself briefly against the lamp's glass and found no sermon in the pane. Eugenie lowered the lamp as if the light had grown heavier. "If I asked you to stop thinking of me," she said, and did not finish. Zéphine said nothing. Sometimes silence was the way to tell the truth and keep your life at the same time. Eugenie nodded once, as if they had made a bargain. She turned back up the path, the light casting her shadow ahead like a woman leading herself home. When Zéphine returned to the quarters, the doll had turned, not physically. Cloth does not move itself, but in the way a presence can alter in a room. It seemed to have rolled nearer the edge of the basket. A pin lay on the floor, honest and gleaming. Zéphine picked it up and, after a long breath, slid it into the cloth at the left shoulder, slantwise, a stitch that could be let out if needed. The next days brought weather trying to decide itself. Thunderheads piled like sermon words over the cypress, then broke apart without water. The cane leaves talked nonsense. A white visitor came to stay 2 nights, a cousin of Eugenie's with cheeks like roses painted over grief. She brought bright ribbons and a little dog that trembled at everything and never barked. She played the pianoforte badly and told Adrian he was too thin. She told Eugenie she looked delicate. "Delicate is not a compliment," Eugenie replied, then looked at her hands as if the word had bitten there. That night, Zéphine found Etienne waiting with a skiff you could pretend belonged to anyone. "Tomorrow," he said softly. "There's river fog in the forecast if the wind minds itself. I can get us to Belchasse and from there we can bend inland. We don't have to keep the river's honesty if we don't want to." "Tomorrow," she echoed, and tried on the word. It fit as if she had been altering a dress for months to wear it in 1 hour. She went back to the quarters and wrote names as small as ants. She wrote the dairy girls and pressed the paper to her lips. She wrote Adelie's and tucked it into a crease as if the paper itself could taste bread and fat and stubborn mercy. She wrote Etienne's because people must also be carried. She wrote her own and nearly didn't, then did, because survival needs to hear itself called by name. Near midnight she woke to a sound that took the shape of a floorboard's complaint and then of breath. Eugenie stood at the door of the quarters. At the door. White ladies did not come to the door at night unless something had gone very wrong or very right with their souls. She had a shawl thrown over a nightdress and her hair braided in a long tail over one shoulder like a child sent to bed early in a story. "Come," Eugenie said, not loud. "Please." Adelie stirred in her pallet and the dairy girl sat up, eyes wide as if night had risen to meet day. Zéphine got to her feet, the basket, a thought heavy in her mind. She did not pick it up. "Where?" she asked. "My room," said Eugenie. "Now." The stair felt like a spine you had to climb carefully if you didn't want to paralyze the whole body. In the mistress's room the smell had changed. It was fresher, like rain that had been thinking about you. On the bed lay the baptism gown, spread as for a christening. Beside it, a heap of white gloves as if hands had been skinned and left to dry. "I dreamed of drowning," Eugenie said without drama. But it was not the river. It was cloth. I could not breathe for the threads. She moved as if she were old. "Tell me what I have to do to pull the threads out." Zephine knew 100 answers to that question. None of them could be said to her in a room lit by a coiled lamp with the door open and the walls listening. She reached for the gown and slid her fingers along a seam she herself had made until she found the place where it could be undone without damage. She tugged the thread free 3 inches and then laid it across Eugenie's open palm. "First," she said, "you feel the pull." Eugenie closed her fingers around the thread as if it were a pulse. A step sounded in the hall. Adrian. He filled the doorway with the energy of a man not used to not being the subject of a story in his own house. "What is this?" he asked, his voice already arranging itself to be obeyed. "A lesson," said Eugenie, and Adrian blinked as if he had heard a word pronounced in a strange but correct way. "Leave us." He did not move. "Leave us," she repeated, quieter. Power sometimes travels best on small boats. After a long moment, Adrian lifted his hands in a performance of acquiescence and stepped back. His footsteps retreated down the hallway as if something with more legs than a man had learned to walk. Zephine placed the thread across the doll's chest in her mind and saw how easily a life can be cut when one thread is tugged without care. She thought of the skiff waiting in the willow mouth, of fog rolling right on time if the wind kept its word. She thought of names folded small and a river that did not ask for papers. "Tell me," Eugenie said, "what will come if I do not let go of the thread?" Zephine had never been asked to speak truth in that room. She took a breath that tasted of cedar and old starch and the salt of someone not yet crying. "It will pull other seams," she said. "One day you will look and see all your dresses turning to pieces on their own. The house will gape. The mirror will not return your face but all the faces you did not look at. Your sleep will sour. And the river will take what the house cannot hold." Eugenie swallowed as if she had tried to eat something without chewing. "And if I let go?" "You will be colder," Zephine said. "And smaller for a while. Then you might be the right size for yourself." Eugenie nodded once as if accepting a sentence she had written for someone else and found, upon reading aloud, that it fit her mouth too neatly to deny. She opened her hand. The thread lay across her palm like a line on a map you decide not to travel. "Take it," she said, and Zephine did, because sometimes you must carry a thing a little way so the person who needs to lay it down can believe it is gone. A sound rose up the stair like a wind but was not wind. It carried the memory of men counting and women not crying. It carried the drum of feet going because they had to. It carried, faintly, frogs spelling a word. Adelie's shape filled the doorway like a blessing. "Child," she said, meaning Zephine, "the fog's on the river already." Eugenie turned toward the window as if she could see through shutters and night and the press of all the things she had not learned. "You have a basket," she said without turning back. "Yes, ma'am." "Take it." Zephine stood very still. The air arranged itself in her lungs. The doll in the basket seemed to be listening with new respect. "And you?" she asked before she could stop herself. Eugenie's mouth trembled at the place where a woman's mouth remembers sucking milk. "I will sit with what I have done," she said, and it was the bravest thing Zephine had ever heard her say. Etienne's step sounded soft in the hall. He had come up without announcing himself, a river person's skill. Adelie's eyes were on Zephine, deep and calm as the bottom of a heavy pot. The dairy girl stood behind them both like a word just before it is spoken. "Now," Adelie said, not loud, not soft. Zephine lifted the basket. Pins clinked, honest as coins. She looked once at the white gloves in their heap like shed skins and once at the gown spread like a small ghost. She looked at Eugenie, whose hands were empty in a way that suggested possibility rather than loss. They moved together through the house, Adelie in front, Etienne at Zéphine's shoulder, the dairy girl at the rear, the way a good sentence keeps its strongest word for last. The hall smelled for one long breath of clean rain. On the porch the knight reached up with both hands. Fog had come to sit on the grass and on the shell road. It made small lights bigger and distances kinder. Somewhere a frog proved its single thesis with patience. Etienne's skiff made a dry whisper against the bank. Zéphine placed the basket in the skiff and felt the world tilt toward decision. Behind her, the house breathed out a long-held breath. She stepped into the boat and it accepted her the way water accepts a shape it has always had. Etienne steadied. Adelie's hand touched her shoulder once. The dairy girl's fingers brushed the rim like benediction. A sound came from the house, not Adrian's voice, not the bell. The faintest tearing, like a scene giving where it had been strained too long. Eugenie's silhouette stood in the window and, just as the skiff pushed off and night gathered them in, the lamp in her hand burned higher as if fed by a story learning its last and most dangerous word. The river took the skiff, the fog closed, and in the breath between stroke and stroke, a shadow rose from the water's skin and put its hand, cold, insistent, on the back of Zéphine's neck, as if to ask a question she had never let herself hear before. She half-turned, breath caught, needle-weight sleep forgotten, and the doll in the basket shifted as if answering, its cloth whispering a single syllable. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. Syllable. Home. The cloth had no tongue and yet the sound was true in Zéphine's bones, a note plucked on a string that ran from the nape of her neck down her spine into the hollow place below her ribs where she kept courage and fear in the same jar. Home, the doll had said, as if the river possessed such a thing, as if water remembered a particular door. The fog wrapped them close, and Etienne's oar dipped and rose with the hush of someone blessing a sleeping child. "Did you hear it?" he whispered. Zéphine kept her eyes on the black water that showed nothing back. "I heard what I needed," she said. The answer steadied her hands. She tucked the doll deeper among the scraps and names and felt the basket settle as if relieved. Behind them, the plantation shrank into a smudge of lamplight and softer dark. No dogs barked. No bell. Either the fog had eaten sound or the house had run out of the habit of commanding at night. Etienne read the river by touch and patience. He kept the skiff near the shadows where cypress roots combed the bank like old fingers. Spanish moss hung so low in places that it stroked Zéphine's braided hair, leaving a cool line across her scalp like a reminder written on skin. The frog kept arguing its small thesis. Crickets took the other side without malice. The river made all arguments polite. "How far to Bellechasse?" Zéphine asked, not because she wanted a number but because speech was a kind of tether. 2 hours if the fog keeps us hidden and the current minds its manners. Less if the wind remembers not to be proud, Etienne said. From there, we slide quiet into a cane channel and then walk a mile through Yupon and Palmetto to a place with a cart that looks like it belongs to a mule more than a man. And then? He smiled, a brief forgiveness of the night. And then we stop telling the river what we're doing every minute. Zéphine let herself imagine walking with her own feet toward a road she had chosen. It was not a large imagining, just a candle held in cupped hands. The basket pressed against her shin, a steadying weight. The book with the hollow back rested beneath the doll, a small geometry of defiance. She did not plan a city in her mind or a lifetime, she planned the next 3 breaths and the way a reed would sound if the wind turned slightly. A shape rose ahead, the suggestion of a fallen tree half swallowed by water. Etienne slowed, listening with his palms. The skiff grazed the bark, a whisper like paper. They slipped past. The fog thickened until even the oar had to feel for the river's face. "Zéphine," Etienne said without turning. "If the river asks you who you are, what do you tell it?" "That I am a seam," she answered. "And a seam either opens or holds." He nodded. "Hold, then." They came to Bellechasse not by sight but by the smell of smoke that belonged to town and not to house, by the feel of water shouldering itself into a narrower mood, by the way night shifted toward people's work even while people slept. Etienne let the skiff nose into a little pocket where reeds hit a rotten dock. He tied with rope that remembered other outs and ins. They waited a full minute, breathing the new air, letting their eyes adjust from no shape to near shape. Now, he said. They moved like careful thieves, Zéphine with the basket and the doll and the names, Etienne with the oar as if it were only a long walking stick a man might reasonably carry at night to discourage snakes and thoughts. They climbed a bank softened by years and slipped into cane that made its own hallway, leaves slick as clean knives brushing their arms. The path was no path, and then it was. Etienne knew the little choices that kept you between nettle and water. A mile, 2, time had no courage here. It did not tell them how much of itself had passed. Zéphine kept count by the number of times her breath found a new shape. When they reached the cart, it announced itself by a patient mule's sigh. The animal stood with one hip cocked and the expression of a creature that had seen men think themselves in charge of many foolish things. She answers to CLO, Etienne said. Short for Clotilde. Don't say the rest unless she needs to remember her mother was proud. Zéphine touched the mule's shoulder. The hide was warm, life at an honest temperature. CLO, she said. The mule flicked an ear and accepted her. The cart looked like anonymity. A crate of cane knives lay under a tarp like a promise no one planned to keep. Etienne tucked the basket among sacks that smelled of nothing in particular. He handed Zéphine a brimmed straw hat without looking too closely at how natural her head would wear it. Sit like you always belonged here, he said. The world believes what you repeat. They rolled onto a path that would be a road by noon. The first birds had not yet rehearsed. The sky had not made up its mind about color. A dog barked once and then, perhaps remembering it was night's employee, fell silent again. Zéphine and Etienne did not speak. The cart's wheels learned each rut and preferred it the way bodies prefer a version of pain they know. Dawn came the way good news comes in a house where bad news has stayed long, hesitant, ready to withdraw if anyone raised a voice. Blue lifted from the cane. The fog thought about leaving. A woman in a far field, small as punctuation, bent and stood, a patient grammar of labor. When the first proper light found them, Etienne had already placed them on a road that offered choices with both hands. Left, he said. Toward Braithwaite. There's a woman there who makes book spines out of rag rope. She will give us a thread that cannot be seen and cannot be cut. And after Braithwaite? Zéphine asked, feeling the world broaden like a seam let out at the ribs. After Braithwaite we put river behind us for a while. The farther we go, the more the land will pretend to be different and the more it will reveal that it is the same. He looked at her then. You don't have to go the full length of my stubbornness. If you say stop, we stop. I won't say stop, she said, and meant it for this morning and not for all mornings. The woman in Braithwaite opened her door before they knocked. She had thread clipped in her teeth and a strip of blue calico tied around her head like a soft crown. Her hands were scarred in the way of people who had wrestled tools and won. You're late, she said, which was her way of saying I am ready. Bring in your basket, child. I hear it breathing from here. Zéphine did not startle at the word child. In this woman's mouth it did not mean small or owned. It meant someone allowed to learn. She set the basket on a table that had been plain so often it forgot its original intentions and now was glad to be any flat rectangle that could hold work. Name's Issa, the woman said, working the rag rope with her thumbs until it became both stronger and softer. Short for Iselin when I need to testify for myself in front of officials who like long names and longer papers. Show me your pages. Zéphine took the traveler's book from beneath the doll as carefully as food from a sleeping child's hand. Issa felt the spine with 2 fingers and nodded. Hollowed proper, she said. Not slit like a throat. Like a seed husk. What you got to put in? Names, Zéphine said. The word left her mouth like steam. Issa did not ask which names. We stitched the gap shut, then, she said. She threaded a needle too big for clothing and too small for sails and pulled a length of linen thread across beeswax until it shone like a decision. Who taught you to read? A man who drew in sand, Zephine said. And who taught you to listen? The river. Issa smiled with the kind of pride that does not claim ownership. Good. You can keep both when paper fails you. She showed Zephine how to lay the names in a hollow that did not exist for people who did not know where to look. You must never open it in anger, she said. Anger's hands shake and tear. Open in hunger or mercy. Those are steadier. They closed the pages and spoke no blessing. Some work asked only to be done and not named out loud. Etienne traded news for silence, who was moving where, who had fallen, who had risen, which fairy took more than it gave. Issa's eyes kept accounts without pencils. When they rose to go, she handed Zephine a small roll of needles wrapped in muslin and something else, a cord tied in 7 knots. For talking without speaking, she said. You untie a knot at a doorway to say we have been here and not been seen. Tie one at a well to say water and watchman both are mean. Tie one at a window to say a woman inside wants to learn. Zephine tucked the cord around her wrist like a bracelet you pretend is jewelry and know is a tool. Thank you, she said, which in this room meant I will use it and not betray its use. They left by the back path that was not a path. The sun climbed into a temper. Cicadas heated the air with their insistence. The mule tolerated all as if God had hired her to do so and paid in hay. Where to now? Zephine asked when it felt safe to make a plan with words. North, Etienne said. We'll follow the backbones the big houses forget. There's a chapelry in Violet where the priest knows how to pray his words backward if he has to. He helps people forward even when his God tells him to sit. Will he help us? He will help the book. And the doll, Etienne glanced at the basket and then at Zephine's face, he will tell you what he thinks he knows and not what he does. What does he think he knows? That calling and cursing are kin who don't speak because family fights are the kind that teach you your own strength. They reached Violet at noon. The church squatted white and hopeful among live oaks that had seen men marry and die and never remember how they promised to treat each other in between. The priest, a brown-skinned man with a body like a grappling hook and eyes that had been disappointed and chose to love anyway, met them under the gallery. You have something made of cloth, he said, as if he could smell its breath. A doll, Zephine answered, steady. He gestured to a bench. Sit. The heat makes fools of us all. Tell me what you are asking of it. Not harm, she said. Not spectacle. I ask it to hold the shape of someone who refuses to look at what she has made of the world. To turn her head and hold it there until her neck learns the truth. The priest watched a swarming fly circle his hand and then not land. Some people will ask you for the doll, he said. They will want to buy justice the way they buy sugar. Tell them it is not for sale, and if you must, tell them the price includes their own skin. I won't sell it, Zephine said. It already belongs too many places. He nodded, satisfied with the shape of that answer. There is a woman in Moreau, 2 miles along the levee, whose boy was taken for a debt that was never written down. She has been keeping her house so clean the floorboards cry. She needs to know how to dirty her hands without losing her soul. You can show her with thread and not with blood. Show her what? How to sew doors, he said. You stitch a certain way at the base of a curtain and a door opens for people who need to go through it and closes for people who don't. It is old knowledge and tired, but it still stretches. Zephine thought of curtains lifting in the house while the smell sat and would not move. I can show her, she said. They stayed an hour, then 2, because some places returned energy to you as interest. When they left, the sky had decided to build a storm that might not come. They walked the levee to Moreau, mule patient beside them, river pretending to be tame. The woman with the crying floorboards opened her door with a rag in hand, face clean past comfort. She had braided her grief so tight her scalp shone through. I am Marjorie, she said. Zephine. They did not speak of the taken boy. They spoke of curtains. Of seams that are not straight because straight is not always honest. Of how to stitch with your hand half open. By dusk the woman's fingers remembered something older than fear. She let her mouth lose its perfect line and become a mouth again. When Zephine left, the woman pressed half a spool of thread into her palm and said, "This was my mother's when her mother went to sea." The thread felt strong and salt-minded. Zephine tucked it into the basket beside the doll and the book and the needles as if laying it in a nest. They slept that night in a shed with a roof that did its best and failed in only 3 places. Rain found them around midnight in lines thin as handwriting. Etienne woke enough to move the mule under the driest corner and to nudge the basket with his foot closer to the wall. Zephine slept with her arm crooked around the basket's handle. She dreamed of a seam so long it went around the world and of hands at intervals along it, each holding, each letting go in turn so the seam could breathe without coming apart. Morning brought news the way morning does in a parish, mixed into bread and gossip, riding on the steam of coffee, folded into the damp of men's shirts. A boy with ears like handles told Etienne that the calabash overseer had ridden to town last night red-faced, swearing a woman had bewitched his hand. "It keeps locking when he reaches for the whip," the boy said, grinning. "He throws it with his left now, and it looks like an insult a chicken would make." "Who does he blame?" Etienne asked, quiet. "The air," the boy said. "And the dairy girl, and the cook, and the river, and the saints, and the frogs. He didn't say your name," he added to Zephine, eyes wide to see if she would flinch at being known. "I am nobody's name right now," she said. "That's the point." They moved on. The road met other roads and exchanged courtesies. The mule rearranged her expectations every mile and found herself equal to each. In Chalmette they passed a place where men had fought a war 20 years ago and were still bragging about it. The field did not care. It held their stories and the bones they had left it with the same polite indifference. Zephine felt a shiver at the thought of ground remembering men who believed themselves the only story. She put her hand on the basket to remind herself of small, stubborn narratives that did not require canon. At the edge of the city proper, they bent away from noise and commerce and chose a path that stayed true to kitchens and courtyards. Word had gotten ahead of them in the way it does when people need something more than they need to keep quiet. Women invited Zephine to sit on steps and teach them how to anchor a hem that did not want to mind. She taught them about the 7-knotted cord and how a knot tied twice says danger but a knot looped once and tucked says wait. She taught them that thread takes instruction best from steady breath. She did not show them the doll. That was not for public work. But she let the book rest in their palms, closed, to feel the weight of hidden names. Some cried without crying out. By the time the sun angled toward orange, she had given away 2 needles and taken in 3 stories and threaded 1 new cord for a girl who had lost her mother and found, in the lack, a violence in herself she did not want to feed. "Give your hands to small tasks," Zephine told her. "Hurt will ask to be fed, you don't have to be its cook." They slept in a room above a baker's shop, the smell of bread rising like prayer through the cracks of the floorboards. Etienne lay with one arm flung over his eyes, a man whose backbone had thought too much in one day. Zephine sat cross-legged with the doll in her lap and unpinned the 3 pins at the neck. She rolled them between finger and thumb as if feeling a pulse. "We are not done," she whispered to the cloth that had once said home. "We have begun to make a place where that word does not shame us." She did not expect an answer. The doll had already spent its one word. It lay with the poise of a thing that can wait longer than people. The morning after, news found them before they found their shoes. Adrian Renault had posted notices. A reward. Words like property and absconded and traitorous had been piled like sacks of flour into sentences that made men feel tall when they read them aloud. The notices described Zephine's height and the angle of her shoulders and the braid that had never been cut. They did not describe her hands, though, and that was a blessing. Hands can betray you in print if someone loves them enough to remember them. "They will look harder now," Etienne said, rolling a notice into a tight pole and then unrolling it flat again as if coaxing it toward honesty. "He has friends who don't deserve friends." "Let them look," Zephine said. "We will stop in places the notices don't know how to name." They altered their route, trading open roads for courtyards, courtyards for kitchens, kitchens for the backsides of gardens where beans climbed in corkscrews and okra stood like green fingers pointing heaven down to earth. They became news and reply. In Bywater, a woman named Pelagie hid them behind drying sheets and fed them rice that tasted of clean water and salt. She told them that Eugenie had stopped wearing gloves entirely, that she kept her hands in her lap now and looked at them as if they were letters she could not read and suspected contained both love and a bill. She sent blankets to the quarters, Pelagie added, as if mentioning weather. Good ones, not the thin kind that brag about their weave. Blankets are not names, Zéphine said. No, Pelagie agreed. But sometimes a woman has to practice kindness on things before she can risk it on people. Zéphine turned that over the way a seamstress turns a collar to see if the underside had been stitched with as much respect as the public side. She did not plan to return. She did not plan to forgive. But she believed in practice the way she believed in thread, a small thing done right, then again, until the doing changed the doer. They left the city's edge by a road that pretended to be bored of itself. Cypress stood like old women at a wake, gossiping in lace. The sun set in a mannerly way and then, less mannerly, darkness arrived all at once, as if a door had been shut in the world's face. They camped beneath a live oak whose arms made a roof better than most. The mule slept as if she dreamed of even ground. Etienne snored once and then stopped, embarrassed in his sleep. Zéphine stared up at the little pieces of sky between leaves and wished the word home did not carry so much echo. Sometime near midnight the air changed. The little wind that had been stitching the edges of the night together smoothed its hand over the world and stopped. Night insects paused without telling each other to. Zéphine sat up, every inch of skin a listening ear. The doll felt heavier in the basket. Etienne was awake too, his hand finding the cart's handle without moving toward it. "What is it?" he whispered. "Someone walking who doesn't know how to hide," she said. Footsteps. 2 sets. Not in a hurry. The kind of pace men use when they mean to own a space before they enter it. Etienne's jaw tightened. The footsteps stopped just beyond the line of dark that even the moon didn't care to solve. "Evening," a voice said. "White. Careful not to sound proud in failing." "No evening here," Etienne answered. "Only sleep." "We're looking for company that doesn't want to be company," the man said, and Zéphine could hear paper in his pocket before he touched it. A woman. Gifted with her hands. Stole herself from a benevolent household. The words were church talk worn at the elbows. Etienne stood. He did not step forward. "I have no women here," he said, which, strictly, in the grammar of ownership the men understood, was true. "Only a mule that sleeps more honest than most men." A chuckle from the dark. "We got coin says otherwise." The sound of the paper shifting, the way a notice gathers itself to leap out and bite. "We'll look. We have the right." "No one has the right to make sleep into fear," Etienne said, and his voice had turned into a tool with a handle you could trust. The men stepped forward. Moonlight caught a hat brim and a mustache that had tried too hard. One held a lantern at his hip. The other had a hand in his coat, not yet committed to any kind of future. "This is nothing," Zéphine told herself quietly. "This is night men. They can be turned like cloth if you don't let the cloth boss you." She reached into the basket and held the doll so her palm covered its blank face. She felt for the pins. Neck pins out. Shoulder pin out. 2 long ones remained in the roll from Issa's muslin. She did not think of throats or hearts. She thought of sleeves too tight to lift arms with grace. She slid one pin into the space between the doll's shoulder blades and angled it so the cloth resisted without tearing. She slid the second into the small of the back, an old dressmaker's trick that taught fabric to hang straight when it wanted to pull wrong. The man with the lantern took one more step and his boot met a root his eyes had not read. He stumbled. That was not a curse, that was root and boot having their say. But when he righted himself and tried to lift the lantern higher, his shoulder refused a full arc. He grunted, surprised. The other man reached to steady the lantern with a hand that found his belt instead. He swore and then, embarrassed, laughed. "Be easy," Etienne said, as if to friends. "You'll spill your light." The first man tried again. His shoulders said no. His pride said yes. Pride rarely wins that argument. He lowered the lantern and squinted as if the dark had gotten personal. "We'll come back with a deputy," he said. "Maybe a warrant if we feel like pretending." "Pretend careful," Etienne said. They left with their boots saying things to the ground. Zéphine did not take her hand from the doll until the sounds had been eaten by the trees. When she eased the pins out, Cloth sighed, her own shoulder eased, and somewhere an owl accepted the knight's apology for the interruption. "They'll come back," Etienne said. "Then we will not be here," she answered. By dawn, they weren't. They turned the cart toward a group of houses where no one signed their full names on anything, and yet everyone could find a birth or a death when it needed to be found. Here, news of the notices had arrived and been folded into bread and then eaten. Here, women said, "Sit, and drink, and show me, and take this," and did not say the word safe because they knew it angered the dark to hear it. Zéphine taught a girl to stitch a seam so fine it resembled a riverbank at low water. She showed a widow how to leave a knot in the jamb of a door so men who came to count bodies would lose track at 12 and go away thinking themselves complete. And at the edge of everything, the name of Eugenie Renault kept showing up not as a threat but as a question. She walked to the quarters at night, one woman said, wonder and suspicion mixing like lye and fat into something that might be soap if you stirred long enough. She carried a lamp and no whip. She sent a letter to a cousin, said another, shelling peas with the rhythm of a machine. The cousin burned it unread and sent the ashes back because embarrassment travels faster than repentance. She took off her gloves, said Pelagie when they slipped back through Bywater at dusk like a rumor that stayed polite. She let her hands touch bread. Hands learn, Zéphine said, not to forgive but to describe the world honestly. In the third week of going and teaching and not being caught, a new piece of news arrived. Adrien Renault had fallen from a horse not his own while riding too fast toward an idea that felt like vengeance. He had lived because men like him had a way of living beyond their usefulness. But his pride had broken in a place medicine could not set. He had retired to his study and closed the door and let the smell that had once followed his wife choose him, too. "What will you do?" Etienne asked Zéphine as they sat on steps that had welcomed 100 feet before theirs. "Keep moving," she said. "I am not his lesson. I am my own." They moved. North toward a parish where the map pretended the road was straight and the road pretended it had not been cut by water and made to grow back crooked. They passed men who looked through them and past them and did not see their faces because their faces did not appear on papers stamped with seals. They passed a woman singing a song about a bird that forgot its name and learned 2 others and survived because of it. Zéphine liked that song. She sang back without sound. The doll grew lighter in her hands even as its work deepened. She stopped pricking its cloth except when the world required reminder. She told it stories instead. She told it about Marjorie's floorboards, about Issa's knots, about the priest who prayed backward and forward and made both sound like walking. She told it about a girl's hands that shook less when they held a needle than when they held a hope. She told it about her own breath and how it found her in strange rooms like a friend who arrives without knocking. Winds change. Rivers do what they were paid to do by gravity. Men tire. Women remember. It was in the 2nd month, counting by moons and mending, that the book asked to be opened. Not in anger. In mercy. They were in a place whose name was a lie, New Hope. The old hope lived there still, threadbare and proud. A man had died and the paper that should have said who inherited his debts had been misplaced into a drawer that preferred secrets. The widow's sons stood with hats off and mouths tight. The overseer from a neighboring place made polite talk about sympathy while eyeing the mule as if bargaining with himself about his right to take. "Bring me a table," Zéphine said to the widow quietly. "Not too clean." The woman set out a table that had held life and death and everything middle. Zéphine laid the book on it and let her fingers feel for the seam Issa had hidden. She loosened it only as much as needed. Names sat like seed in a furrow, their smallness the point. She took out 3, the widow's, the dead man's, and a name the widow had never said aloud because she had been told not to, her own mother's, born free 2 parishes over and kidnapped young, a paper trail cut and scattered so men could pretend they had not known it existed. Zephine set the names in a line. She did not read them to the room. She read them to the air. The air remembered. The overseer coughed as if dust had surprised him. The widow's older boy put his hand to his chest as if his ribs had shifted to make room for something that fit better now. The younger boy whispered, "Mama," as if you were 5 again and not 15. "We will not be robbed with our mouths closed," Zephine said. "We will not be made to speak a language that misnames theft as paperwork." She closed the book and stitched it shut with 2 steady passes of thread. "You will take these names to the priest who knows both roads. He will speak in the language that the men who like seals think is the only one, and he will speak in the other also." The overseer left with his hat at the wrong angle. Men who believe themselves the world's grammar dislike being corrected by a conjunction. Word of work like this travels faster than the workers. It arrived ahead of them in St. Bernard Parish and made 2 men nervous and 3 women brave. It reached even the big houses where women like Eugenie had once taught fear to hold a teacup without rattling. In one such house, a young white woman with eyes still soft from not knowing life well enough read a cousin's letter and hid it under her mattress and began to leave bread where bread could be taken without making anyone a thief. In a calabash, Eugenie learned to sit with what she had done. She sent no men after Zephine anymore because she had found the end of that road and it had not offered her a chair. She wrote letters she did not mail. She took the baptism gown each morning and laid it upon the bed with hands that had finally chosen a temperature. She did not wear gloves. The smell that had once followed her chose not to embarrass itself with her anymore. It kept to Adrian's study where papers molded in a piano string, in a room below, loosened with a sound like a tired breath. One day, months into the leaving that became a life, Zephine walked alone to a place where a bayou thought about whether to join a river or to keep gossiping with itself under the cypress. Etienne had gone to trade news with a man who measured distances in candles. The mule grazed as if grass had done her a personal kindness. The air held itself with the courtesy of winter in Louisiana, the kind that deceives with warmth and then, just at sundown, remembers to bite. Zephine set the basket down and took out the doll. She had not pricked it in weeks. She did not fear what would happen if she never did again. She smoothed the cloth with the heel of her hand the way you smooth a child's hair. She looked at the blank face and saw, for the first time, not absence but invitation. The doll had said home. She wanted to answer. "What does that word mean?" she asked the water. "Is it a door or a seam?" The water said its ancient thing. Wind wrote quick notes at the margins and then erased them. A heron lifted from the far bank with the dignity of a woman who refuses to be hurried by anything less than love. "I think it is a verb," Zephine said. "And I think I can learn it." She took the 7-knot cord from her wrist and untied one. She tied another. She made the cord honest to the day. "We are not hunted this hour, we are learning. The door is not a door but a curtain and it can be moved." Etienne returned with candles and news. "A steamboat pilot says Adrian has lost interest in cards," he said. "He sits staring at a window as if it owed him money." "He will not write his own ending," Zephine said. "Men like him hire someone else to do it and then sue if they don't like the handwriting." "And your mistress?" "She is not mine," Zephine said without heat. "She is her own problem now." That night they slept in a shed with a roof that had learned to love the idea of straight lines and failed. The wind pulled a trick and slid cold under their blankets. Zephine curled around the basket without resentful humor. The doll's cloth held the day's warmth the way a skillet holds noon after you take it off the fire. She slept and dreamed a dream too simple to be clever, a room with a table. Thread. A book. A door not locked but closed against rain. Voices. Not many. Enough. Hands at work, not just hers. In the months that followed, the dream began to practice being true. In a town that believed itself too small for maps, St. Amand, then farther, then somewhere between, Zephine found a house with a broken porch that wanted to be mended and walls that had not been listened to in years. It had been a fisherman's if you believed the hooks in the doorway, a midwife's if you believed the jar of herbs forgotten on a shelf. It had a room no bigger than a large table and another no smaller than a woman's breath when she is afraid and chooses anyway. The roof leaked in only 2 places this time. "I can make this hold," Zephine said, and the house let her brag. They paid for it in work and in a language money sometimes understands, not coin, but skill. Etienne built a door that closed with a sound like a sentence finished. The mule grazed the right side of the yard into a polite lawn. Women came. First 1, then 2, then as many as the room could hold without the walls thinking they had earned a right to listen. They brought cloth and names and the need to learn. They brought bread and news and a kind of quiet that made the loud world feel far away. Zephine set the doll on a shelf where it could see the table. She did not hide it. She did not introduce it. It sat with the poise of a tool that does not need to declare itself. Sometimes a woman would touch the cloth with 2 fingers and then take her hand away again as if she had put it to a stream and felt a current she hadn't expected. "What is it?" newcomers asked. "A reminder," Zephine said. "That we can make shapes that the world pretends to own. That we can ask cloth to hold what we do not want to put in a person. That we can return harm to its maker without swallowing it." She taught reading to those who wanted it and could risk it. She taught writing to a few who found that the sound of a pencil on paper made their hearts beat in a new meter. She taught hiding in daylight, which was the most advanced lesson in the curriculum, how to stitch a message into a hem and also how to be content with 1 word written and not 3 when danger breathed behind you. She taught that thread was a way to speak to someone's future self, when they put on the garment, when they lifted the curtain, when they found the knot at the well. In the 2nd year, a child was born in the back room, not to a woman who slept there but to a woman who had learned there and returned to enact the part of life that requires everyone. The child's cry filled the house with clean sound. Zephine held the bowl and the cloth and then, when it was time, the child, and felt in her wrists a strength that did not require pins or paper. The mother named the girl Camellia, an odd choice, maybe, given who had pressed camellias into a book at Calabash and who had had to learn how to take off gloves. But names can be redeemed when placed on a new brow. In the 3rd year, a man came with papers and a hat too stiff. He said the house belonged to a cousin twice removed of someone no one wanted to name. He said law had found them and asked to be obeyed. Etienne sat with him on the porch and spoke of doors and roofs and of the weather's particular fondness for the shape of this house. The man drank water and listened only as much as a stiff hat allows. He left with nothing but dust on his shoes because sometimes history clogs a man's boots before it ever enters his heart. Zephine set her hand on the doll's shoulder that evening and said, "We did not prick you for that because we are learning to hold without needles." She surprised herself by not crying when she said it. She had thought Joy would have to drag tears out of her or else be counterfeit. Joy, it turned out, sometimes preferred to sit quiet and eat with you. Then, on a day that began with a blue so pure it must have been ashamed of itself, a letter found them. Not by post. By hand. A boy, skinny and respectful of doorways, held it as if it might bite. "From downriver," he said. "From a woman with hair like a rope and a mouth that says I will not be corrected." Eugenie Renault's hand had improved since last Zephine had seen it. The letters were less proud. They sat on the line as if they had been asked to and agreed. The letter said, "I would speak a thing aloud to you with no promise you will listen. Adrian is dead without poetry. He let a candle lean into curtain and learned nothing from the speed of fire. I saved no paper for the law because I am tired of law smell. The house has altered itself. I did not invite it to. It opened a door where there had been mirror. I have sent 4 families away with money and names written on paper that says what should have been obvious. I do not know if I have done enough. I know I have not. I do not ask you to come. I ask you to accept a small truth. I think of the word seam and I hold it in my mouth until it tastes like respect." It ended without a name, which was correct. Names cannot repair a seam on their own. Zephine read the letter twice and then fed it to the stove and watched the flame take it without dignity. She saved the ash in a jar because some endings deserve to be present without being seen. "Do you want to go back?" Etienne asked that night when the corners of the room had just accepted that they were corners and not traps. "No," she said. I want to go on. And where is on? She looked around the small room, at the table and the shelf and the door that finished its sentences. Here, she said. And farther. They went on. The house became 2 houses because walls cannot hold the multiplication that courage demands. Then 3. Then a room in a church where the priest smiled both forward and backward and said, yes, this is what I meant. Then a corner of a cooper's shop where the man who made barrels learned to make room for secrets that did not leak. A girl in one house learned to read so well that she wrote a letter to a man with a hat too stiff and sent him to his own law for mercy and got it. A boy learned to stitch so fine his father, a proud fool, wore his work without noticing and in so doing was warmed by a son he had not earned. And the doll? It remained cloth and not, presence and not. Women touched it before hard conversations. Children were warned away from it and then, when no one watched, gravely touched it and found their fingers unburned and their hearts oddly steadier. Once, a man who had been cruel in small, close ways, always a more dangerous cruelty than the loud kind, reached for it with 2 fingers, giggling. His hand cramped like a truth and did not unclench for a full minute. He left without finishing his joke. The room was relieved to have lost it. Years, then. Enough that the girl called Camellia grew into a tall creature who moved like someone who had once been carried carefully through a doorway and remembered how it felt to be trusted. She learned thread and letters and the art of closing her mouth around anger until it learned her teeth. She called Etienne uncle when she could get away with it and Master Boatman in public when humor needed exercise. She called Zephine by name because titles were only correct when they opened doors and not when they stood in the way. War came close and then far. Men yelled about borders as if lines could love them. Men died being certain and lived being wrong. In the rooms Zephine kept building, thread and breath and paper did their quiet war, which is to say they kept people alive. Some men tried to drag the loud war into the small rooms and were asked, politely and finally, to leave their rifles at the door along with their certainty. One winter, call it the 4th, though counting gave no comfort, the river went low and mean. Food made a different noise in the pot, the sound of making dew. A fever took children in 2 houses and showed mercy only after it had learned all their names. Zephine sewed burial shrouds with a kind of dignity that did not break a person or a seam. She spoke the names into the book not to hide them but to give them a place to lie down without someone counting them for advantage. The spring after that winter, a woman arrived with a face that had once been almost pretty and now was useful. She had walked from a place so far that the dirt on her hem had learned 3 languages. She carried no basket. She asked to borrow a word. Which one? Zephine asked. Home, the woman said, and smiled as if ready to be refused. It is a verb, Zephine said. You may have it if you agree to conjugate. The woman laughed, and the sound made the house sit up a little straighter. They conjugated home together that summer the way you conjugate love, past imperfect to present ongoing, future conditional to the command form that requires both bravery and consent. The woman built a room behind the house with her own hands and cried once when the roof didn't leak and only once. She taught Camellia to write figures in a book so the rooms could track how bread and thread and paper moved, which is a way of respecting work. She taught Zephine that being held is not a project and does not require an invoice. When the war's loudness finally decided to be quiet in their parish, men with different hats came asking for different papers. They said words like freedom and meant them sometimes. They said words like census and meant them never. The rooms adjusted without asking permission. The book opened more often, and not only in mercy. It opened in hunger. It opened to write receipts for labor that would be paid. It opened to write poems and margins that children giggled at and women read while waiting for bread to rise. On a day too clear to belong to anything but laundry, Camellia put the doll in her lap and said, "What do we do with you now?" She was 18 and had the kind of beauty that felt like a trapdoor until she learned where to step. The doll regarded her with the same absence of expression that had once frightened Zephine with its honesty and now soothed her with its discipline. "We do what we have always done," Zephine said from the doorway. "We invite truth to sit. If it refuses, we do not let it leave without at least leaving its hat." Camellia threaded a needle. Does truth wear a hat? Always, Zéphine said. Else people would recognize it too quickly and make a fuss. Camellia thought about that, then pricked her finger without dramatics, and the sight of a single red bead on young Brown's skin made Zéphine's breath stop for a beat with a memory of a different kind of pin and a different kind of red. She let the breath go. Life had earned it. In the next decade, because time goes whether we shake our heads or not, the houses learned to be schools and then something else unnamed. Men with uniforms came asking for votes and were given soup. They left with votes when it made sense. A preacher's son who had learned to read in one of the rooms ran for a thing he could win and then did not win and learned that winning is not always better than holding your neighbor's name right in your mouth. A woman who had been a child in the second house wrote a pamphlet about bread that was also about economics and another about thread that was also about diplomacy. People said thank you and meant it. Eugenie Renault's name came like weather, now and then. She had remarried a man who smelled of horses and humility. She had buried 2 infants who took 1 breath each and then chose another world. She had given away the pianoforte because music is not for the proud. She had made a garden where nothing white, flower or glove, was allowed unless it had dirt on it. She died with her hands unloved, which is not a moral but is a detail. Zéphine heard this and did not smile and did not frown. She took up a needle and taught a girl to bury her knot and pull it through gently so the seam would not pucker. Etienne, who had once rowed a skiff through fog as if the world were fragile and needed him to be careful, grew sturdy and then softer. He laughed more and with less apology. He taught boys and girls to read the river for moods and to talk to it as if it could say more than it was already saying. He forgot to be a solitary man and forgot it so thoroughly that when he died he had to apologize to 6 people separately for leaving. Zéphine was old in her hands before she was old in her eyes. Her fingers kept what they learned longer than her knees did. She did not mind. Sitting was good work too. When she could not walk to the far house where a woman had just written her first letter to herself, they carried the letter to her and she kissed the paper and said, "You did that. Not me. Not this room. You." She ate bread that tasted of yeast and patience, and the air learned to come when she opened a window because it liked the way she held it. One twilight, after storms had practiced all day and then declared themselves done, she took the doll down from the shelf and carried it outside. The sky still flashed occasionally, remembering. The yard smelled of washed dirt and crushed herbs. Camellia, now grown into a woman with 3 names, one for friends, one for enemies, one for herself, followed without asking why. "What will you do?" Camellia asked, because sometimes it is useful to let the older say a thing aloud so it becomes truer. Zéphine smoothed the doll's cloth. It had thinned in places, the way a well-loved shirt does. "I will give it back," she said. "To whom?" "To the river," she said, and the word felt not like surrender but like punctuation at the end of a sentence you know you will keep speaking under your breath for years. They walked to the water. It had risen modestly to greet them, as if it too had learned to respect the quiet grandness of small acts. Zéphine held the doll at her chest a moment longer, an old woman holding her own younger face. She pressed her lips to the cloth, which tasted of sun and kitchen smoke and 1,000 hands. She whispered, "We are home," and let the doll float. It did not sink. It did not sail away immediately. It lay on the skin of the river like a true sentence lays on a listener's heart, without demand, without apology, present. The current took it by the feet first, gently, as if to say, "Come." It went. The moon, behind clouds, approved by doing nothing dramatic. Camellia stood with her shoulder against Zéphine's as if propping up a door and not a person. "Are we finished?" she asked. "We are never finished," Zéphine said, and smiled because the thought did not tire her. "But we have learned the difference between thread and chain." They turned back to the house with the roof that now leaked in only one earnest place in storms. Children ran in the yard like punctuation erring toward exclamation. A woman called across the fence to ask for a needle and was told to come and take 6. Etienne's older leaned against the porch as if it had always been a broom. The book sat on the shelf, its spine handsome as a scar you have decided to love. Zéphine's knees hurt and she did not mind. That night, for the first time since a fog-wrapped skiff took her away from Calabash, she dreamed of Eugenie without needing to wake. In the dream, Eugenie stood at the river and addressed the color of earth between storms. She held out her hands, unloved, and they were empty, which is another way to say ready. She did not speak. She did not have to. The river spoke everything between them. When Zéphine woke, she did not reach for the basket out of habit and find it gone. She reached for a mug and for bread and for Camelia's laugh in the next room. On a day when the figs were declaring themselves, a girl came into the house with a book. She was narrow with hunger and wide with hope. She said, "I want to put names inside this where no one can steal them," and held out what she had brought. It was not a pretty book. It was the wrong size. Its cover had been mended with a kind of stubbornness that did not promise longevity. It was perfect. Zéphine took it with hands that looked old in the way of hands that chose usefulness over display. She turned it over and over until she was sure she loved it. She opened the drawer where she kept needles and cords and the jar of ash that once had been a letter that did not know how to ask forgiveness properly. She took out a scrap of muslin and a length of thread that had belonged to a mother who went to sea. "We will make a hollow that is not theft," she said to the girl. "We will make a room inside this room. And when you carry it, you will carry everyone who taught you and everyone you will teach." Together, they stitched. The girl's hands shook and then steadied. The room listened but did not intrude. Outside, the mule, old now and permission proud, stamped once at a fly. A storm thought about assembling and then put down its tools for the day. The river, visible through the gap where the porch rail refused to be straight, went on saying its faithful thing. At dusk, when the book lay on the table complete and complicated and ready to pretend to be ordinary, Camelia brought in a lamp. The light caught the book's spine and made it shine as if bragging. Zéphine laughed softly and, without thinking, reached to dim its pride with her hand. She stopped herself and let it glow. Pride, in a thing that had earned it, had the right to stand on a table and be seen. "We came far," Camelia said, sitting, her knees touching Zéphine's. "We did not go anywhere the river didn't already know," Zéphine said. They looked at each other, and in the small quiet that followed, 100 names rearranged themselves into futures. Much later, when she lay in the room that had kept and forgiven her aging, Zéphine felt the room get thin in the way rooms do when a story asks for its last spoken word. She did not fear it. She had stitched alongside endings before. She put her hand on the table where the book slept and then on the wall where a girl had once leaned to read her first sentence. She put her hand over her own heart and felt the seam there, neatly done, strong, not too tight. "Hold," she whispered to it, into the house, into the rooms beyond rooms she had helped call into being. "Hold." In the morning, when Camelia found her, she was still holding. The room held too. The book did not open, it did not need to. The doll, somewhere downriver these years and years, might have fetched up in reeds and become home to frogs, or might have sunk and become a private current, or might have floated out to sea and learned salt as a second language. It did not matter. Cloth had taught them what it needed to teach. They buried Zéphine under a fig tree that did not ask for theology. Women came from rooms and houses and ships and pasts. They brought thread. They tied threads to branches until the tree looked festive with the evidence of small labor. They told stories out loud and in their heads and on paper and in bread. They poured water and it obeyed gravity and also love. Camelia spoke last. She did not cry because her mouth had a job and crying would have made it clumsy. She said, "She taught us to call without cursing. She taught us to prick where harm hides and to lay down the pin when the seam holds by its own training. She sewed us rooms. We will keep adding walls that breathe and doors that do not forget rain. When we say home, we will mean work and rest, both." After, when evening put its palm on the day's forehead and called it done, Camelia went to the river alone. She had a small doll in her hand, cloth the color of stormlight, stitched with a thread the shade of tea. She had made it herself, not to frighten or to remind anyone but to set a tradition down in water where it would not mold. She whispered a name no one else knew and let the doll go and watched it learn the language of surface and then the grammar of current. She laughed, not sadly. She turned and walked back to the house that held the rooms that held the names that held the people. On the porch, the lamp waited to be lit. Inside, someone asked where the knot cord was kept. Someone else burned bread and swore and laughed. Somewhere, a child sounded out a word in the room, this room and that room, and the ones that had not yet found their corners applauded. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.